Imagine the scene. It's 1873. A man named Thomas Reed has been riding through the New Mexico desert for 4 days. No town in sight, no river nearby. His supplies ran out on the third day. The heat is over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. His lips so cracked that when he tried to drink from the empty canteen, blood mixed with dry saliva. Thomas wasn't a famous explorer. He wasn't a comic book hero. He was just a ranch hand trying to reach Santa Fe to sell cattle. And on that fourth day, when his horse stopped and refused to go any further, Thomas dismounted, looked around, and thought, "This is where I die." He didn't die, but what he ate in those final days, what he pulled from the dry earth, what he chewed without knowing whether it was poison or food, is one of the most brutally honest stories about what it truly meant to survive in the real Old West. Movies show cowboys sitting around a campfire, eating beans from a can, drinking strong coffee, and smiling at an orange-colored horizon. But the reality was something else entirely. The reality was a man hunched over a weak fire, trying to cook the meat of an unknown animal, without salt, without seasoning, with muddy water drawn from a hole in the ground, and praying that it wouldn't kill him before the next morning. So a question arises that few ever ask. What did the men and women of the Old West actually eat? What kept a cowboy on his feet after 12 hours in the saddle? What kept a settler from collapsing in the middle of a Kansas winter? What made the difference between arriving alive at the next village or being found weeks later, dried out like leather in the sun? Today we're going to explore that. Not the romanticized version, the real, raw, and at times shocking version of the foods that sustained the men and women of 19th century America in the middle of nowhere. To understand what they ate, you first need to understand where they lived. The Old West wasn't a place. It was a condition. It meant living hundreds of miles from the nearest market. It meant going months without seeing a town. It meant depending entirely on what the land offered or didn't offer. Between 1840 and 1890, more than 4 million people crossed the United States heading west. Settlers, entire families, ranch workers, former soldiers, fugitives, adventurers. All of them facing the same fundamental problem. How to feed themselves in the middle of a land that wasn't theirs, that they didn't know, and that had no mercy for the unprepared. There were no supermarkets, no industrial preservatives, no refrigerators. Most inland towns were little more than a row of wooden shacks, a saloon, and a general store with an uncertain inventory. In many territories, the nearest food was days away on horseback. In that context, eating wasn't a pleasure. It was a survival strategy. Let's start with the most important food of the Old West. It's not what you're thinking. It's not meat. It's not beans. It's jerky, what the Americans called by a word derived from the Quechua term charca, inherited from the Andean civilizations and spread across the continent through the native peoples of North America. The technique was simple and brilliant at the same time. Thin strips of meat, usually buffalo, deer, or beef, were rubbed with salt when salt was available, then exposed to sun and wind for days. The result was a food that could last months without spoiling, that weighed almost nothing, that could be carried in a trouser pocket, and that provided enough concentrated protein to keep a man moving when there was nothing else left to eat. The cowboys who made long cattle drives, journeys that could last 2 to 4 months, depended on jerky as an emergency reserve. When the group's cook fell behind, when game was scarce, when the weather closed in and lighting a fire was impossible, it was jerky that kept everyone on their feet. But there was a detail the movies never show. The texture was like leather. Chewing poorly made jerky for hours was an exercise in physical endurance. Men lost teeth, gums bled, and still they chewed, because it was that or hunger. James Bridger, one of the most famous frontier scouts of the 19th century, described in personal letters that he spent periods eating exclusively jerky for weeks at a time, mixed with melted snow. He said the body complained, but the body adapted. According to him, the greatest enemy wasn't hunger. It was the tedium of eating the same thing day after day, with no variation, no flavor, no joy. If jerky was the emergency reserve, beans were the backbone of the Old West diet. Specifically pinto beans, small, speckled, cheap, and extraordinarily nutritious. They were the most common food in cowboy camps, on settler farms, and at the makeshift tables of towns still taking shape. The reason was practical. Dried beans weighed little, lasted virtually forever if kept away from moisture, and when cooked slowly with whatever was available, a piece of salt pork, some herbs, water, produced a meal with enough calories and protein for a full day of hard labor. The group's cook, called the cookie, the same word we use today for a biscuit, was often the most respected person on a cattle drive. Not by the newer cowboys, but by the veterans, because the cookie controlled the food. And controlling food in the Old West was a form of power that few understood until they needed it. A good cookie knew how to make the beans last, knew how to season with the bare minimum, knew when to ration and when to serve generously. A bad cookie could demoralize an entire group within days. There's an account from 1878, documented by historian J. Frank Dobie, about a cattle drive in Texas where the cookie fell seriously ill in the third week of travel. With no one to manage the food, the cowboys began eating without restraint in the first few days. By the second week, the bean reserves were down by half. By the third week, with still 2 months ahead of them, the group erupted into open conflict. 2 men left the drive. One slipped away in the dead of night, taking with him a sack of flour that wasn't his. Food wasn't just nutrition. It was the social glue that held groups of men together under extreme conditions. But not everyone was a cowboy. Most of the people who went west were families. Settlers. Ordinary people trying to build a life in an unfamiliar land. And for those families, corn was what separated survival from death. Corn could be grown at a speed that other grains couldn't match. In well-prepared soil, with enough rain, a family could have functional harvest in fewer than 90 days. It was ground into cornmeal, mixed with water, animal fat, to make cornbread, the thick, dense, and flavorless bread that became the symbol of settler cooking. It was served at breakfast. It was carried in pockets as a snack. It was the last thing children ate before going to sleep. In years of poor harvest, it was all there was. A woman named Eleanor Pruitt Stewart, who moved to Wyoming in 1909 and documented her life in letters later published, described a winter in which her family lived almost exclusively on cornbread and lard for 3 months. She wrote about it with an almost unsettling calm, as though it were as ordinary as talking about the weather. And it was ordinary. It was life. What history books rarely mention is the physical toll of that restricted diet. Without variety, without adequate vitamins, settlers suffered with alarming frequency from conditions that today would be easily prevented. Gums that bled without apparent cause, a clear sign of scurvy caused by a lack of vitamin C, vision that worsened in dark environments, vitamin A deficiency, progressive muscle weakness that many attributed to hard labor, but which was, in reality, chronic malnutrition. And this is where the story becomes more interesting and darker. Because while settlers suffered from nutritional deficiencies they didn't even know how to name, the native peoples who had inhabited those lands for centuries didn't suffer from the same problems. And the reason lay directly in what they ate. Native Americans had developed, over generations, sophisticated knowledge of the territory's food resources. They knew which plants were edible. They knew when to harvest them. They knew how to prepare them to maximize nutritional value and minimize the toxic compounds that some contained in their raw state. The pinyon nut, the seed of the single-leaf pinyon pine, common in the American Southwest, was one of the most nutrient-dense foods available in the region. Rich in healthy fats, protein, and minerals, it was harvested in autumn and stored for winter. A small amount provided enough calories to keep an adult warm and active in below-freezing temperatures. The agave, the same plant from which tequila is extracted today, was used in multiple ways. The heart of the plant, slowly roasted in pits in the ground for up to 2 days, transformed into a sweet and highly caloric pulp. The fibers were used to make ropes and textiles. The spines served as needles. It was a plant that fed, clothed, and equipped all at once. The camas root, a bulb found in the moist meadows of the Pacific Northwest, was described by Meriwether Lewis during the Lewis and Clark expedition as one of the most agreeable foods I have ever tasted in the wild. It was roasted, boiled, or dried and ground into flour. Nutritious, versatile, and available in large quantities during spring. Most settlers ignored this knowledge, some out of pride, others out of distrust, many simply because there was no functional communication between cultures, and they paid the price. Let's return to Thomas Reed, the man who believed he was going to die in the New Mexico desert. On the fourth day without food, mildly delirious from dehydration and heat, Thomas saw something he recognized from a conversation he had had months earlier with a trader who had lived among the Pueblo people for nearly a decade. It was a prickly pear cactus, what the Mexicans called nopal, the flat, spine-covered pad that looks hostile at first glance, and that the untrained eye automatically dismisses as inedible. Thomas remembered that the trader had said something about the red fruits at the top, that they could be eaten, that there was water inside. He used his knife to cut the fruits, called tunas, carefully removing the microscopic spines. He ate 6 of them. They were sweet, moist, and for a moment it seemed to Thomas that he had never eaten anything so wonderful in his life. The fruits of the prickly pear cactus have a high water content, more than 80%, along with natural sugars, vitamin C, and minerals such as magnesium and potassium. They were exactly what a dehydrated and exhausted body needed. It wasn't a miraculous cure. Thomas still spent another night in the desert, still suffered. But he arrived alive at the next settlement 2 days later. He survived because, by chance, someone had shared a fragment of knowledge that wasn't originally his. Knowledge that the native peoples of that region had possessed for centuries. There were other foods that cowboys and settlers used that rarely appear in popular depictions of the period. Tallow, the solid fat rendered from beef or buffalo, was used both as food and as protection. Eaten plain in situations of extreme necessity, it provided enough dense calories to keep the body functioning in the cold. Mixed with flour, it became a kind of dough that could be baked on hot stones. Rubbed on the skin, it protected against extreme cold and chapping. The most experienced used tallow on cracked lips, split hands, and boots to waterproof them. Wheat flour, when available, was turned into a type of quick bread called hardtack, a hard biscuit, almost flavorless, of a consistency that made teeth ache. But it lasted for months. It didn't spoil. It could be soaked in hot water to soften when the jaw could no longer take the chewing. Civil War soldiers carried hardtack. Settlers carried hardtack. It was the common denominator of the diet of anyone who needed to travel for long periods without access to fresh food. Hunting supplemented everything else when luck was on the side. Deer, rabbit, grouse, quail. In regions near rivers, fish. The most experienced knew that too much rabbit was dangerous. Rabbit starvation, as it later became known, was a form of malnutrition caused by the exclusive consumption of lean protein without enough fat. The men who survived had learned, usually the hard way, that they needed to diversify even when diversification was minimal. Coffee deserves special mention because in the Old West, it was not a luxury. It was a necessity, not for the pleasure, though the pleasure was welcome, but for the concrete effects it produced on exhausted bodies. Caffeine fought off drowsiness during night watches. The warmth of the drink heated the body's core on cold nights. The act of boiling the water eliminated some of the pathogens that made river and well water potentially fatal. Cowboys drank their coffee with absurd amounts of sugar when available, and without sugar with resigned indifference when there was none. It was served in the morning before anything else, and again at night before sleeping. In many groups, the absence of coffee was a sign that something had gone very wrong. A travel diary from 1862, written by a settler named Ezra Meeker during his crossing of the Oregon Trail, mentions the scarcity of coffee more than 20 times over 4 months. Each mention carried an emotional weight disproportionate to what one would expect from a simple beverage. It was as though the absence of coffee represented the absence of civilization, a constant reminder of how far they were from anything familiar. Films and series about the Old West have a quality that makes them irresistible and, at the same time, fundamentally dishonest. They show men who look healthy. Faces weathered by the sun, yes. Dusty clothes, of course. But functional bodies. Full sets of teeth. Vision good enough to aim. Strength enough for fights and long pursuits on horseback. The historical reality differed in virtually every one of those details. The medical records of the era, the few that exist, show that most men who lived in the West for extended periods displayed some degree of chronic malnutrition. Bad teeth were so common, they were considered inevitable. Vision problems were frequent. The life expectancy of a cowboy who worked cattle drives for years on end was significantly lower than that of an urban laborer of the same period. Scurvy, the disease that medieval Europeans associated with long sea voyages, was common in the American interior of the 19th century. Settlers who endured long winters without access to fresh fruits and vegetables developed symptoms with a disturbing regularity: swollen and bleeding gums, teeth that began to loosen, extreme fatigue, joint pain. Many died without understanding what was killing them. The solution, ironically, was often just a few feet away. Wild plants with enough vitamin C to prevent scurvy grew in many regions of the West. Some native tribes used boiled pine needles as a tea, rich in vitamin C, effective against scurvy, and available in winter when everything else was frozen. But that knowledge rarely crossed cultural barriers in time to save lives that could have been saved. What makes this period so fascinating, and at the same time so tragically human, is the distance between what people knew and what they would have needed to know in order to survive well. They weren't stupid people. They were uninformed people in a new land, facing challenges for which their culture of origin had not prepared them. They brought with them the foods they knew, the flour, the dried beans, the salt pork, and tried to replicate the diet of wherever they came from in a completely different environment. When it worked, it was through luck or pragmatic adaptation. When it didn't, the consequences were measured in lives. Those who survived best were, in most cases, the ones who learned to observe, who paid attention to what the native peoples ate, who accepted guidance from those who knew the territory, who set aside the pride of knowing how things are done, and acknowledged that there were forms of knowledge they had not brought with them in their baggage. Thomas Reed returned to New Mexico 3 years after his near death in the desert. This time, before setting out, he spent 2 weeks talking with traders and guides who knew the territory. He learned to identify the prickly pear cactus. He learned which roots were edible in the dry season. He learned to carry less weight and more knowledge. He crossed that same desert with ease. The difference between the Thomas who nearly died and the Thomas who crossed without trouble wasn't in the equipment. It wasn't in luck. It was in what he knew about what the land had to offer those willing to learn. The real Old West was not the place of abundance that popular narratives suggest. It was a place where the relationship with food was visceral, constant, and often terrifying. It was a place where the difference between knowing and not knowing what to eat could literally cost a life. Where knowledge about plants, about preservation, about how to extract nutrition from the bare minimum was just as valuable as a weapon or a horse. And perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this story is this: much of that knowledge existed. It was available. It was being practiced by entire communities who had inhabited that land for generations. But the combination of cultural arrogance, language barriers, and systematic prejudice prevented that knowledge from being transferred effectively. And people died because of it. From scurvy, from dehydration, from hunger in lands where there was enough food for everyone, just not in the form they recognized. The story of the Old West is often told as a story of conquest, of expansion, of progress. But it is also, quietly, the story of lost knowledge, of costly arrogance, and of men and women who learned or failed to learn. That survival begins with the humility to acknowledge what you don't know. If you made it this far, you already know that the Old West they never told you about in school is far darker, far more complex, and far more fascinating than any movie has ever shown. Every week we explore these hidden sides of history, the stories left out of textbooks, the decisions that cost lives, the lost knowledge would have changed everything if it had been preserved. If this is the kind of story that grips you, subscribe now. Hit the bell and leave a comment. Which aspect of the real Old West have you never seen in any film or series? See you in the next video.